We're here at Dad's greenhouse. Dad uses a 253 cell tray. The cell dimensions are slightly larger than my 288s. The external dimension of the tray is still 26.5 by 13.25, and the 253s will cause the plant to have just a slightly larger stem. The consequence is you get fewer plants in your greenhouse. Dad built this greenhouse and I helped in 1991, and that was when this system first took place here in Kentucky. Prior to the advent of float beds and greenhouses, we grew our plants in what was called a plant bed, and the old timers would use a process of burning firewood on top of that ground to kill any insects or any weed seed that may be present in that soil. And the farmer would burn an area approximately 10 feet wide and 100 feet long, or maybe 12 feet wide and 100 feet long. And when we started doing plant beds here in the 70s, we used a process called gassing, and we would cover that area with a piece of plastic, and we would insert a chemical underneath there called methyl bromide. And methyl bromide was some bad stuff. It would kill bugs, it would kill weeds, it would even kill a house cat if the house cat walked across the plastic and their claw poked a hole in the plastic. But we stopped gassing plant beds when we started doing these floats. The plant bed area was a sacred area. That was your best dirt on your farm, usually close to a water source, so that if it got dry during growing of the plants, you could sprinkle over the top with a water hose, and many farmers could be found out beside their house in their plant beds every evening watering their plant beds. Plant beds were covered with a thin porous material that was called remay. You may see this used today to cover up sensitive plants when there's a threat of frost. It's white, it's a spun-bound polypropylene. And that plant bed area would be covered with the remay until the plants got up of good size and the weather became mild, and then we would take those covers off. And since those covers cost $100 a piece in the 70s and 80s and even early 90s, that was some serious coin. Those covers would be done up real nice and neat and put away and saved for next season. And so out here beside Mom and Dad's house, we have an area, I'm going to guess it's about a 1/4 acre, where we used to raise plant beds, and we actually have a float bed in that same location now. So Mom and Dad built the house here in 74, and Dad had his first plant bed out here in 75 or 76, and then in 91 we had the float beds, and I believe it was actually 92 when we put the greenhouse up. And we've been growing the plants in the same relative location. You want them close to your home so you can look in on them on a daily basis. And I don't know if you can get down real close on these, Salam, but you can see germination has just started with these trays here. We try to keep 2 to 3 weeks between my greenhouse at my house and this greenhouse at his house, so that when we start transplanting these into the field, they'll be ready in waves. And not only that, when we do the cutting and the housing and the bulking and the stripping, it'll be ready at the proper time without having to wait too long. Tobacco plants are perishable, so we have to get our timing right. And what we're about to do today is lay some black plastic in the float bed. And like I said earlier, this float bed is in the same location where we used to have the plant beds. When I was a kid, we had 7 plant beds. Plant beds were very labor intensive because the tobacco seeds were sprinkled across the soil, and when the plants got big enough, you would go out there and by hand pull one plant at a time, and you would select only the biggest and strongest plants to take to the field. And when you pulled those plants, you had to set them within 24 hours or they would perish. So these float plants have a significant advantage over plant beds because these float plants will keep. If it rains us out during transplanting, we'll just bring them back in here and set them back on the water. I've even left them sitting out in the grass and just take a hose and go over the top of them. You know, if they're big mature plants, they don't necessarily have to float on a bed of water as long as they get water. And then when the ground dries out, we can go back to the field with them. Whereas plant bed plants, I know a couple of farmers that had several bundles. When you pulled those plant bed plants, you would take a burlap sack and lay it flat on the ground, And when you pulled those plants, you would hold them in your hand till you got a handful about that big around, and all the roots in one direction and all the stems in the other. And you would lay them on that sack until you had a mound of plants, all the root balls on one side and the foliage on the other. And you would pull that sack together, and some farmers used a hog ring to staple that bag shut. Other farmers, we used a piece of string. And we would tie that bundle of plants snug but not too tight to choke them, and then pick that bundle of plants up and set it root down on a trailer or a wagon. And I know some farmers that got rained out from setting, and they took that bundle of plants with those mud clods on the bottom of them and set them in the tobacco barn. If they had a tobacco barn that was cool and dark, where it was damp, they would leave them in that barn for a few days. But every now and then you go check on them plants that you had pulled, and they'd be slimy, they'd be mushy, and you'd have to just throw those away and go pull some more. But I do remember growing up, my brother and my mom and myself and my mom's best friend from high school, the four of us, we would pull plants all day while Dad was at work. And when Dad got home from work, he would go disc the field, and we would roll the setter about 6 o'clock, and it may be 8, it may be 9, it may be 10 o'clock when we got those plants in the field, and then the next day the cycle repeated. So it took 4 people all day to get enough plants together just to set a couple acres. And now I can get that same number of plants gathered up off the water and on the wagon in just a few minutes. And they're a lot easier to grow here. I don't know if you noticed or not, there's no weeds in the greenhouse. Even if there is, they're very sparse, very few. Those plant beds were very labor intensive. We had to go out there and hand weed these plant beds every day. And it was a matter of pride to have a plant bed full of tobacco plants without a weed in it. And in the same fashion that we clip the top of these plants with a mower, we would clip the tops of the plant beds with a weed eater. And what that does, it takes off part of that leaf, part of that flag, as long as you don't nip the bud that's down in between. And then that plant, in response to that action, will become hardy. And what you really want to go to the field with is a plant. In the plant bed, the plants had to have a stem as big as my pinky to make the grade. Now these greenhouse plants and float bed plants, the stems won't be quite that big, but you still want a hardy plant. And when we have some plants that are big enough, I'll show you what a hardy plant looks like. You can take the top end of the plant and you can touch it back around to the root. You can make a bracelet out of that tobacco plant and it wouldn't break. Plants that are quickly grown and plants that are very succulent, they will snap if you try to do that to them. So let's head over here toward the float bed area and see if we can get some plastic down before that storm hits us. Keep going, Bob.
Keep going.
I just want to do one base.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
Kind of win.
Okay.
I like the bricks.
You want me to go around and pull
Greenhouse, take a 20-footer. The greenhouses that you saw at Carrollton Greenhouse are so large, they require a 20-foot by 100-foot black plastic, and so does Ryan's. It's a 30-foot or a 35-foot house. You have to have the 20-foot plastic. This 16-foot plastic fits this 12-foot bed pretty good because you've got plastic that goes down the side on both sides, and then when you come to a divider, a sectional divider like that one up there, you have to have a little bit of extra slack. So you can't have plastic that's the same exact size as the bed. It won't fit.
Yeah, put it this way.
on top of the rail or below?
I don't care. Put it over here.